Middle East peace has eluded the region of the Middle East and American presidents who have tried for decades. But in the region, we're talking millennia that we have seen all sorts of struggles and strife in the Middle East. Of course, the nature of that strife and conflict has changed somewhat over time, but in recent decades, American presidents have really tried their darndest to bring peace in the Middle East, particularly between Israelis and Palestinians, Israelis and the Arab world. We've seen some positive developments over time where, for example, the United States brokered peace between Israel and Egypt. Later, we had relations open up between Israel and Jordan, and the United States helped to facilitate that. But just last week, the United Arab Emirates and Israel normalized relations. This is considerable and historic, particularly because it's the first Arab Gulf country to normalize relations with Israel, to open the door to conversations, to actually start up trade agreements, get those dialogues going on. That's just the beginning. It looks like we could see Oman and Bahrain, Morocco, other countries start opening up their doors to Israel in a way they never had before. To talk about the historical significance of this and the Trump strategy in the Middle East to help bring this about, I am very pleased to be joined by two experts in Middle East affairs. Mario Loyola is a senior fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and Ilan Berman is vice president at the American Foreign Policy Council, and they both join us now here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. It's so good to have you.
Great to be here.
I really appreciate it, especially because this is so historic in a complex region of the world. I mean, the complications that are involved here are tremendous. We also have seen past administrations look at this idea of let's bring peace in the Middle East by bringing together the Israelis and the Palestinians. We're seeing something very different go on at this point in terms of what President Trump is doing. Let's start with you, Mario, please, about some of the historical context here. You had a great piece in National Review last week that really laid out a lot of the history here and sort of how some of this has evolved over time. What's your takeaway?
Well, I think the key insight starts with understanding what makes America valuable to the governments of the Middle East. As I said in my piece, and I've written many times before, Obama was operating under a very profound misconception about why people were talking to him, why people were talking to the government of the United States in the Middle East. The reason why the United States is valuable is not because people are interested in what the American president thinks is fair or just or right. What they want from the United States is for the United States to be able to serve an underwriting role, just like underwriters in a financial transaction, in a bond flotation or an initial public offering, where the underwriter, the United States, is underwriting the risks of security, the risks of the deal to the person who's really putting their security at risk, which in this case is Israel. And Israel will make much greater concessions for peace with the United States standing strongly behind it than if Israel is worried about the United States. And so that's why Obama taking a more impartial role as arbiter of the dispute between Palestinians and Israelis made the United States irrelevant to both the Palestinians and the Israelis. Trump has gone in a very different direction. He's standing firmly beside Israel. He's moving against Israel's enemies, such as Iran. He's continuing with maximum pressure on Iran, pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal, ordered the killing of Qasem Soleimani, is likely doing other things on a covert level, moved the embassy to Jerusalem. All of these things have served to make the United States relevant again in the Middle East, both as a strong ally of Israel and as a relevant negotiating partner for the Arab side. And I think that that's been indispensable to bringing the Arabs and the Israelis closer together.
I want to play a clip. This is cut two. It's Jared Kushner over the weekend on the Fox News channel talking about how this all came about as the culmination of 3 years of diplomacy and sort of a different perspective, a different outlook being brought by the Trump administration to Middle East policy. And when we come back after playing the clip, Ilan Berman, I'm going to want to get your thoughts on that as well as what Mario Loyola just shared. Take a look at this.
So this deal is really the culmination of 3.5 years of incredible diplomacy by President Trump. President Trump started his administration with his first foreign trip, where he went to Riyadh, where he addressed the 54 Muslim nations. Then he went to Israel, where he met with the Jewish leaders, and then he went to Rome, where he met with the Pope and other leaders. And so President Trump has set out a course to really change the Middle East and to try to bring more peace to the world. This was a great culmination of it, and there's a lot of steps along the way. We hosted a conference in Warsaw where we brought the Middle East closer together. We hosted a conference in Bahrain where we brought everyone together. And, you know, even the president's steps that he took, which were widely criticized in the foreign policy world, like moving the embassy to Jerusalem, was a very critical step. That showed people in the region that, number one, President Trump, unlike past politicians, keeps his promises, and he won't be bullied out of doing things that he thinks is right. And that strength and courage of conviction allowed him to build very strong relationships with our regional allies that had previously been forsaken. And that confidence that they both had in him allowed them to take this historic step forward. And I'll also say that one of the other critical steps along the way was President Trump getting out of the disastrous Iran deal. That deal sent $150 billion to the largest state sponsor of terrorism, one of the worst deals perhaps in history. And President Trump's leadership has greatly constrained the reach of a big menace in the region.
Ilan Berman, Vice President at the American Foreign Policy Council, what Jared Kushner, Senior Advisor to the President, was talking about, and he's been running point on a lot of the Middle East policy, helping out there. He talked about the Warsaw and Bahrain conferences, which were significant opportunities to bring these countries together. He talked about how President Trump has kept his promises, for example, on Jerusalem, and he's been rebuilding this idea that the United States understands the threat that Iran poses, hence withdrawing from the Iranian nuclear deal, doing things to mend fences in the region with countries that had been sort of set aside by the Obama presidency, the Obama administration. What do you make of that, and what are you seeing here from a strategic standpoint that the Trump administration is doing that has brought about such a truly unprecedented and historic feat, and how it differs from previous administrations?
Right. So I think there's really three big points that need to be made here. First of all, the new agreement between the UAE and Israel is historic, but it's not surprising. In fact, it is the culmination of a decade or more of quiet diplomacy that the Israelis have been engaging in, right, with regard to not only the UAE, but a number of other countries in the Persian Gulf and in North Africa. And that dialogue initially started as shared concerns over a rising Iran, a nearly nuclear Iran, and one that seemed to be on the march in the Middle East. But over the last several years, those ties have expanded to include everything from trade to infrastructure to telecom to really all aspects of bilateral relations. And those quiet conversations are now moving out into the open. They're coming of age. And I suspect that the UAE-Israel deal is just the beginning, because there are other countries like Bahrain, like Oman, like Morocco, that are likely contenders to be next. Right? The second big point is that this is an enormous triumph for Israeli foreign policy. This is, I would argue, this is the single cardinal sort of largest achievement of Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu's foreign policy credentials. And, you know, those are pretty big credentials, because what he's managed to do over the last decade is to fundamentally reorient the conversation in the Middle East. A dozen years ago, when you looked at Israeli politics, center, left, right, every single party, if they wanted to be taken seriously, had to have some sort of plan for engagement with the Palestinians. That's not the case anymore, right? And so what you've seen over the last decade is the shift from an inside-out strategy to an outside-in strategy. The old paradigm was that you had to make peace with the Palestinians first before you could talk to the Arab world. But what we're seeing today is that's actually not true. In fact, Israel has managed to build very robust relations with an assortment of countries in the Middle East, even though the Israeli-Palestinian track is frozen, at least for now, right? And this gets us to sort of the third point, that the deal is the culmination of the Trump administration's approach to the Middle East, but it is very much part of a larger approach. So the conventional wisdom has been for a long time that the White House doesn't know what it's doing in the Middle East, that it's sort of fumbling around, and even at times it's eyeing the exits, and it wants to get out of regional entanglements. But if you look closely, what the administration's actually been pursuing has been this three-pronged policy, right? On the one hand, you have maximum pressure against Iran in the form of economic sanctions and political pressure designed to isolate Iran, bring them back to the negotiating table internationally. The second prong is the deal of the century. As Mr. Kushner said, this broad framework for prosperity between Israel and the Palestinians. But right in the middle, the connective tissue between those two poles is this idea of a Middle East security alliance, a security architecture in the Middle East that could function something like an Arab NATO that could provide security for Israel, but also net Israel more closely into regional politics. And so that, to me, is I think right now the most germane aspect of the strategy, because that's what we're making progress on. Israel's getting more secure, is expanding its relations in the region, and I think things are changing in a big way.
Mario Loyola, I think that one of the things that we can pull from what Ilan was just describing is that the Trump administration came in, they saw the many flaws, failures of the Obama policy, cozying up to Iran while distancing itself from the United States, rather, from the allies in the Middle East, the Arab countries, and from Israel. And they recognized also that meanwhile, you had Israel doing back-channel conversations with the UAE and many other countries. And they saw that this opportunity there, that I think the Obama administration just didn't care about, didn't see any reason to follow through. Speak to that a little bit, please. And then I know that you have this idea, and I think it fits right in the conversation about sort of the simple rule for Middle East policy relative to the Obama administration's policy.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say I don't look at what the Trump administration saw coming in at the beginning of 2017 quite the way that you just described it. What I remember thinking every year of the Obama administration was that with every year that passed under Obama policies, we were going to have more and more of a disaster to clean up and more to fix. I think that the Bush administration handed off to the Obama administration in a situation in the Middle East that had been very difficult, but that had been brought to a promising point. I mean, we had achieved victory in Iraq essentially between 2007 and 2008. All of the major political groupings in Iraq, except for the two extremist groups, were in favor of a ongoing, lasting alliance with the United States. That in turn was an essential pillar of an architecture of containing Iran that rested on the rest of our regional alliances, particularly with the Gulf Arabs, putting pressure on the Iran nuclear program and support for the pro-democracy movement inside Iran. And that's what the Obama administration needed to do, was to keep strengthening that relationship with Iraq, keep strengthening our regional alliances, keep putting pressure on the Iran nuclear program, keep supporting the pro-democracy movement in Iran. And of course, what the Obama did in every case was exactly the opposite. In every one of those instances, it did exactly the opposite. And so the fundamentals began to deteriorate very rapidly. Within 3 years of Obama taking power, the United States was out of Iraq and ISIS was on the march. Of course, Obama completely misdiagnosed what a serious threat ISIS was. And then when the Obama administration finally got back into the game to move against ISIS in some small measure, they basically did it as Iran's subordinate proxy air force. And so everything that the United States was doing, because they were doing it at such a small scale within Iraqi politics, they were really just an adjutant to the Iranian program of hegemony inside of Iraq. And so with every year that passed, the situation deteriorated more and more. The Syrian civil war got going. The Obama administration decided not to intervene in the Syrian civil war. That we can debate whether that was a good decision or not, but they simultaneously decided to let other people intervene in the Syrian civil war on the other side. And then they decided not to do anything about defending Iraq from the consequences of this civil war, which is what allowed the civil war to spill over to the Iraqi side. So by the time the Trump administration gets to power, what it's looking at in the Middle East is a complete disaster, with Iranian power extending all the way from Iran to Israeli's borders in Lebanon, and another pincer forming through Yemen to threaten Israel from the south, essentially, now that Iran has taken the place of Arab extremist regimes in supporting the Hamas. And so it was very important to move in the other direction. And and I'll just close by saying that I was in the White House already at the time on the environmental policy side, and I had my doubts about whether the president could be effective given how skeptical he was of America's long-term commitments in the Middle East. And I'm happy to see that as the years have passed, the Trump administration and President Trump personally have come to see that without going as far as nation building, it's important for the United States, it's important for America's position in the world, for the United States to remain the preeminent power in the Middle East. And that's what makes all of these peaceful developments possible.
We're wrapping up our conversation with Ilan Berman, who's vice president at the American Foreign Policy Council, and Mario Loyola, senior fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Ilan, your thoughts on what Mario just shared?
No, I think Mario is exactly correct. And you do have that creative tension that exists in the Trump administration's approach to the region. There is a tendency on the part of the president and the part of his advisors to not be very excited about open-ended commitments. And so the way the administration has backed away from engagement in northern Syria, engagement in Afghanistan, reflects a worry that there is mission creep, that we're going to be in the region forever without defined objectives. But I would point out that is not the same thing as not having a strategy for the region. And in fact, it's very clear, as Mario said, that the administration has planted some very important flags in the region about things that it thinks are very important and necessary to do in order to preserve the security of our allies and preserve American interest. Right? That conversation starts at maximum pressure vis-a-vis Iran, right? Because the administration, from its earliest days, identified the 2015 nuclear deal with Iran as a vehicle for Iranian empowerment rather than a vehicle for Iranian moderation, right? The big gamble that the Obama administration bet on was the idea that if we were nicer to Iran, if we provided them with massive direct and indirect sanctions relief, they would behave better regionally. And what that ended up doing was empowering Iran's worst impulses. And the Trump administration has been trying to put Iran back into a box for its entire term so far. And it's been successful in doing that. Maximum pressure has had a lot of impact on the stability of the regime, Iranian solvency. But that's not the sum total of what the administration is trying to do in the Middle East. There's a lot of things going on. And I think we ignore them. When we ignore them, we don't really understand sort of what the real lay of the land in the region is.
Mario Loyola, real quick, where do you think things will head next? Because I think there's reason for optimism that I know you write in your piece that it's possible Saudi Arabia could finally open up relations with Israel. Oman and Bahrain are being talked about, and Morocco. Where do you see things going?
So the countries that you just mentioned, Bahrain, Oman, Saudi Arabia, these are the Gulf Cooperation Council, which are the sort of military partners of the United States among the Gulf kingdoms, and they coordinate their foreign policy very, very closely. So I think it's fair to expect, it's reasonable to expect that they will follow in UAE's footsteps. The United Arab Emirates has always had the most pro-Anglo orientation of all of these kingdoms, so it's not surprising that they moved first. But I would also point out we have President Trump receiving the Prime Minister of Iraq this week, and that's another very important move. And I hope that people don't forget that Iraq really matters. Iraq is a very valuable potential ally for the United States. It has remained a partner of the United States even during the time when the Obama administration sort of didn't really care about Iraq and was happy to let the Iranians take over Iraq. Well, it turns out that the Iraqis were not happy to let the Iranians take over Iraq, even though half their country is Shiite. And that's a very, very hopeful sign, because if America is able to revive Iraq as its alliance with Iraq as a strong one in the region, Iraq could eventually become America's most important ally in the Middle East. And if that happens, then the containment of Iran will really have moved forward by leaps and bounds. And that's the kind of containment that will set the Islamic Revolution of Iran onto its final days. So I hope that America remains committed to that alliance with Iraq.
A quick add-on, Ilan, anything you want to add real quick?
No, I think Mario's right. I mean, the real fundamental question, especially germane now because we're in the political season, is what the president wants to do vis-a-vis Iran moving forward, and what his Democratic challenger wants to do. Right? I mean, there's a very contrasting visions for the region. I would make the argument that the different approaches have been tried before, right? Both of them. And it's very clear which one has garnered the United States more success and American allies more security.
No doubt. I think that's a great final note, although I will add this, that it wasn't that long ago, just a handful of months ago, I had my first of 2 interviews on this program with Fahad Nazir, the official spokesperson for the Saudi embassy in D.C., and I asked him a question. I said, so it seems like Israel and Saudi Arabia have some thawing relations, and his response was, we have no relations with Israel. So it was an interesting response at the time, not surprising at all. I figured I would get something along those lines, but maybe sometime in the near future, we will hear a different response from the folks at the Saudi embassy. Ilan Berman with the American Foreign Policy Council and Mario Loyola at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Thank you so much. We could go for so much longer at this conversation, but I really appreciate your insights today.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Once again, Ilan Berman, Vice President at the American Foreign Policy Council, and Mario Loyola, Senior Fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, joining us here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. A very fascinating conversation, to be sure, and going to the core of our discussion about the shift in strategy of the Trump administration, what President Trump and Jared Kushner and other leaders in the administration have been doing. I want to play a clip from Fox News on over the weekend, and this is Bibi Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, who absolutely, I mean, this is a signature crowning achievement of a decades-long career in foreign affairs on the part of Benjamin Netanyahu. But he was asked in particular about the nature of these discussions and the nature of the strategy for peace in the Middle East. And here's the question and how Bibi Netanyahu answered it.
And you mentioned the Palestinians. For years, we've seen that you have to have peace with the Palestinians first, then the rest of the Arab world will come around. You've kind of turned this on its head in reverse, establishing peace with Arab neighbors and then working on the Palestinian issue.
Look, if you give the Palestinians a veto on peace between Israel and the Arab world, we're never going to have peace with the Arab world because they're refusing to have any kind of realistic settlement. And by the way, I think President Trump's peace plan is the only realistic proposal that has been put forward for many, many decades. But the Palestinians aren't coming around. So I think it's actually not that if we have a breakthrough with the Palestinians, we'll break open to the Arab world. I think it may be the other way around. We have a breakthrough with the Arab states, and the Palestinians will come around in a more realistic way. So I think this is good for peace all around. But I think that I think that it really does begin to change history. It's the third peace agreement that Israel has had with an Arab country, the first peace agreement between Israel and one of the Gulf states, and I think the first peace agreement in which I promulgate this new doctrine. Some people call it the Netanyahu doctrine. It's called peace for peace, and peace through strength. Now, you know peace through strength. Nobody wants to make peace with a weak country. Everybody wants to make peace with a strong country. And I think that under my leadership, Israel has become a very strong country.
I think that was very well put on the part of Prime Minister Netanyahu. This really is remarkable what we're seeing in the Middle East right now. It deserved attention today. It deserves much more attention than we will provide here on this very program. President Trump has and his administration have accomplished quite a feat here. Bibi Netanyahu, the Crown Prince of the United Arab Emirates of Abu Dhabi, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed, just all around, it is historic what we are seeing now in the Middle East. And what Netanyahu said is exactly what we were talking about a few moments ago, which is this new outside-in approach, where instead of just waiting for Israelis and Palestinians to come together and then bring in the Arab countries, the United States said, no, why don't we help to foster these stronger ties between the Arab countries and Israel? And then that can bring out more opportunities for peace in the region that can then push the Palestinians to the table and to making their own concessions. Israel already made concessions. We didn't talk about this. They're not going to expand their annexation of lands in the West Bank. That is considerable. That was a big part of this agreement with the UAE. If we can continue to see this in the coming months, and especially if President Trump is reelected and has the opportunity to continue this policy, as opposed to changing the policy like Joe Biden would clearly want to do, bringing back the Iran nuclear deal and pushing away our Arab partners, unless he recognizes that it's foolish. I don't think he does. I think he's in that Obama mold in terms of the foreign policy matters and failed foreign policy matters. As Mario Loyola pointed out, the simple rule for the Middle East is do the opposite of what Barack Obama was doing. And that's what Trump's been doing, but not what Joe Biden would want to do. We'll see what happens as things unfold, but some encouraging signs to be sure, and this is genuinely historic. Thanks for watching this clip from Jimmy at the Crossroads. You do not want to miss a minute of engaging, intelligent talk. Subscribe today to the Jimmy at the Crossroads YouTube channel, and you'll be sure to catch our live broadcast. I appreciate your support.
I got Jimmy at the crossroads, making sense out of no sense. Yeah.